Rabbi Yitzchok Shochet. Rabbi Shochet was born in Toronto to a family of an unbroken chain of rabbis for 2 centuries. He has 5 children. One of them I know personally because I led him to a trip to Israel, Ezra tour, about 13 or 14 years ago. He was a rabbi at Richmond Synagogue from 1991 to 1993, before being offered the position as a rabbi of Mill Hill Synagogue at the age of 28 in 93. He increased the membership from 450 families to now with more than 1,800 members. Rabbi Shochet wrote a weekly column in the Jewish News for 20 years. Rabbi Shochet also serves often as a panelist on the BBC Sunday morning television program, The Big Questions, and writes a column in the Jewish Weekly. In 2018, he was recruited as part of a panel to write in the American Jewish press. He lectures internationally, and in 2019, he was invited to address 6,000 rabbis and guests as a keynote speaker at the International Chabad Conference in New York. Rabbi Shochet, we cannot thank you enough for giving us from your precious time, especially during these days when your position as a rabbi requires a lot from your time. Thank you very much, and please.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Sitzran. It's wonderful to be joined with you, Rabbi Kiefman, and all others who are joined with us this evening. I trust all is well in Liverpool, and we're all looking forward, of course, to the Yomim Noraim. Yes, maybe with an element of trepidation, but then that's really what the days are all about, and we certainly have a lot to ask for. So with that in mind, let us consider what the significance of the shofar blowing is in our 21st century, and more specifically, maybe even perhaps in the very times in which we are currently living. When the founder of Hasidism, the great Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, saw misfortune threatening the Jewish people, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest where he would meditate. And there he would light a fire and he would recite a special prayer. And the miracle would be accomplished, the misfortune would be averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mizrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he'd go to the same place in the forest and he would say, Rabbeinu Shalala, Master of the universe, I don't know the prayer. I don't know how to light the fire, but I do know the prayer and I know the place, and this must be sufficient. And the miracle again was accomplished. And then thereafter it fell to his disciple, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save the people once more. He would go into the forest and he would say, I don't even know how to light the fire. I don't even know the prayer, but I know the place to come to, and that has to be sufficient. And it was, and the miracle was accomplished. And then it fell to Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin to overcome misfortune when it threatened the people at his time. Sitting in his armchair in his own home, he would place his head in his hands and speak to God. I am unable to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. I can't even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and that has to be sufficient. And it was. Now, there's so many different lessons that we can derive from this anecdote, but for the purposes of tonight, the most glaring and obvious lesson for you and for me is that different people have different ways to engage with their Yiddishkeit, with their Judaism. They have distinct ways by which they identify, individual ways by which they approach God. Some can light the fire. Their souls are aflame. They're full of passion, full of fervor for their faith and their people. They approach every facet of Jewish life with excitement, and they indulge in their Judaism in an ecstatic manner. Then there are others who may not be as deeply connected. They may not feel the full fervor of their souls being drawn to their supernal source above, but they pray. They come to the synagogue on a very regular basis. They remain eminently attached. They may not be dancing on spiritual rooftops, if you will, but their faith, their traditions are still everything to them. Their people mean everything to them. And then there are those from the fire is certainly not discernible, and even prayer is something of an alien concept. Maybe they endured some kind of suffering or pain in some manifestation that led them to become a little bit skeptical or embittered, but they still know where to go. Every now and then they will surface, however sporadically, be it now, during the high holidays, or at a simcha, or God forbid, when the opposite might happen. And finally, there are those for whom the fire seems all but extinguished. Prayer is something other people do. They don't even know where to go. All they have is a story to tell. A story about a parent or a grandparent whom they recall being Jewish, a grandmother who lit Shabbat candles, a mother who fried latkes. They remember their grandfather wrapped in a tallis or their father saying Kaddish. They can tell the story, but that's all. It's a story of yesteryear and times of yore. That really is, to some degree, the history of our people through the ages. We've transformed through the course of time from the fire of once upon a time to the mere storytellers that epitomize so many today. Or as somebody once put it to me, one generation called it Shabbos Kodesh. The next one called it the Sabbath. The generation after that called it Saturday. And today's generation know it as the day in which the Champions League final is played. You think it was a lost cause? You think we ought to give up? You think that we are spectators observing a Shakespearean tragedy playing out? But the significance of the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hahshanah forcefully counters that mindset. You see, there's the whole long blast, the tekiah, representing the wholesome Jew, who's complete in mind, heart, and soul. Then there are the three short blasts, the shavarim. There's something of a lack in the wholesomeness, but still intact, still engaged. Then there are the 9 broken blasts, the trua, which reflect the Jew whose commitment seems rather broken up. It's a choppy existence and only a sporadic commitment. And then there's also the silence. You see, Jewish law mandates that between some of the 3 short blasts and the 9 broken ones in the Amidah, there should be a moment's pause. This is about those who aren't even heard, and they're not heard because they're not even there. But you know what? They too have a story to tell. They too have little embers burning within, and so long as there is a spark, and there is always a spark, there is the potential for even that person, for every person, to aspire to light the fire once more. Because in the final analysis, those who light the fires and those who say the prayers and those who know where to go and those who can but only tell the story, they're all part of the same people, the same family, the same history, and the same destiny. And the shofar emphasizes that reality. There's a well-known story in the Talmud and the Gemara about Rabbi Elisha ben Abua, who was the teacher of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir himself was one of the authors of the Mishnah. And obviously, if he was his teacher, you can imagine how great he was, only that there were a number of different occurrences that transpired in his life. He was one of 4 that had this transcendental experience, and he came out spiritually worse for wear. He also witnessed things that really rocked his boat. He watched his own teacher, Rabbi Chutzpah, whom we read about as one of the 10 martyrs on Yom Kippur. After he was killed, being dragged through the streets, he observed a child falling out of a tree when trying to fulfill a mitzvah, etc. And so he became a heretic. And henceforth, he was known as Acher, which means stranger, other one. But nevertheless, he was a prolific scholar, so Rabbi Meir continued to learn from him. And once on a Shabbos, they were walking along. Rabbi Elisha ben Abua, or Acher, was riding on his horse, and Rabbi Meir was walking alongside him till he came to the outskirts of the city. Whereupon Acher said to Rabbi Meir, "Go back, return. In other words, you can't go beyond this point. It's Shabbos." And Rabbi Meir, taking the opportunity, seized the moment and said, "You too return," meaning more metaphorically in terms of doing teshuvah. To which Acher then replied, "I was riding on my horse on Yom Kippur, behind the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, on the Temple Mount, and I heard a voice coming me'acharei hapargut, from behind the curtain." In other words, from some spiritual place that said, "Shuvu banim shevavim chutz me'acher." Return, all you backsliding children, except for Acher. In other words, I heard the voice telling me that I can't return. I can't do teshuvah. But Rabbi Meir persisted. He said, "Nevertheless, you should return." So here's the question. Why did Rabbi Meir persist in telling his teacher to repent, to return, when Elisha explained to him what he had already heard from some spiritual realm? And the answer is this. Every person is at times his or her authentic self, and at times there is an acher, a stranger within, that challenges our spiritual identity. We're all, to one extent or another, dual personalities. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if you will. You know, you sometimes say, I wasn't being myself today. I'm really sorry. What does it mean, I wasn't being myself? It means what we all know to be true, that there is your authentic self and there is your non-authentic self. Your authentic self is you at your core, at your essence. Your non-authentic self is your acher. It's the stranger within, the Mr. Hyde. Rabbi Meir acknowledged that which Elisha ben Abua heard, but he maintained that he was misinterpreting. He heard right, but he translated wrong. You see, the word chutz can mean except for, or it could also mean out, expel, force out. And that's how he understood the message. The real message was, Shuvu bonim shavavim, return you backsliding children. And how do you do this? How do you go about this? Chutz me'acher, force out, kick out the stranger, detach yourself. Let the stranger from within be expelled and return to your true essence. By way of anecdote, Rabbi Shlomo Halberstam was the Baba of a Rebbe who endured a lot of loss during the Holocaust. And when he emigrated finally to the United States of America, he set up shop first in Manhattan, and he started to literally take some Jews off the street in order to be able to set up a minyan. One person he confronted replied, do I look Jewish? He said, yeah, you most certainly do. He says, okay. In fact, I was very observant and I was a chazan before the war, but now I am what I am. And the Baba of a Rebbe then said to him, it's fine. Still want you to come. In fact, you could be the chazan in our shul. And so every Friday night and every Shabbos day, this man led the services. And over the course of time, the minyan, the group, grew more and more and more. And then one Friday night, there's no sign of the chazan. And so the Baba of a Rebbe sent his son, who later became his successor, to go look for him. And he found him. He found him in the park, sitting on a bench, reading a newspaper and smoking. Came back to his father. His father said, no, did you find him? He says, yeah, I found him. He goes, no, and? He goes, it doesn't matter. And? Really? No, tell me what? He goes, to be honest with you, he's sitting at a park bench now on Shabbos smoking a cigarette. His father looked at him and said, do me a favor, go back and tell him that the ummah, that the community are waiting for him to lead the service. Son couldn't understand. He says, but he's smoking. He's desecrating Shabbos in public. And his father looked at him with a very stern look and he said, Reichert, he's smoking. Der Deutsche Reichert. It's the Nazis who are smoking. And he repeated, please ask him to come. So his son, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi, returned to the park, told the man, my father's waiting for you. Did you tell him that you saw me smoking? Yes, I did. And he repeated what his father had actually said. To which the chazan then replied, look, I don't feel really right going straight from a cigarette back to leading the services, but I'll come along again next week. And he did. And again, after davening, the following week, the son is perturbed, goes over to his father. How could you allow him to lead the service? And again, the same response. Reichert, the Deutsche Reichert. He's smoking. It's the Nazis who are smoking. And after a period of time, the Baba of a Rebbe had moved already to Borough Park and built up this large following of Hasidim, and the chazan wasn't seen there again. 45 years later, this Baba of a Rebbe was in Borough Park at his shul, greeting people, and an elderly man with a white beard and a walking stick walked past and introduced himself as the chazan from the park and asked the Baba of a Rebbe if he could officiate at the wedding of his grandchild. The Baba of a Rebbe greeted him warmly, said that he certainly remembered him and that although he didn't officiate at weddings anymore, he'd be happy to come along and attend the Sheva Brachas. And so he took his son one night and they went along together to the Sheva Brachas. And as they entered the full hall, the elderly man beamed and said, look here, see, these are my approximately 150 grandchildren, and it's all thanks to you. Whereupon the Baba of a Rebbe turned to his son and said, didn't I tell you? It wasn't he who was smoking, it was the Nazis who were smoking. How did Rabbi Meir know to interpret it his way? How did he know that his understanding, return all you backsliding children, and the way to do that is to expel the stranger, was the correct way? Because, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Elisha ben Abua was riding a horse on Yom Kippur. Where? Behind the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. Sure, you can look at the fact that he was riding a horse on Yom Kippur, or you can look at where he's riding that horse. That he's invariably drawn to the Holy of Holies. He knew where to go. He knew the forest, as it were, and so Rabbi Meir knew as well that the fire within him can be ignited once more. You know, one of the most poignant parts of our prayer service during the reading of the Unasana Tokef prayer, the one most moving prayer that captivates everybody, where we reflect on our mortality and who will live and who, God forbid, to the contrary, etc. We recite at the beginning the words, "As a shepherd inspects his flock, making his sheep pass under his rod, Kain Tavir v'Sispar v'Simna, so do you cause to pass and to count and to number, v'Sifkoi nefesh kol chai, you review the soul of every living being." Why are we choosing to use the analogy of sheep and shepherd in order to capture the significance of this day, the awesomeness of this moment? Well, let me take you back to the beginning of our peoplehood. As we were languishing in Egypt, the Medrash relates how one day Moshe was shepherding his father-in-law's sheep when a lamb took off running in the other direction. And we may well know the story. Moshe goes running after the lamb, realizes it's thirsty, gives it to drink, and at the moment God looks down and declares, "As you showed compassion to that lamb, I can entrust you to shepherd my flock as well." So on the surface, it's a story about Moses' leadership. However, on deeper reflection, it's also a glimpse into the nature of a rebellious soul. The runaway lamb is symbolic of the lost Jew, and Moses represents the leader who lovingly reaches out to those who have become disaffiliated. On the surface, when a Jew wanders from Jewish pastures, we see it as rebellion, maybe betrayal. Not so, Moshe says. He follows the precious lamb, knowing it's not rebellion, it's not a lack of love. It's a spiritual thirst that drives them far from home. It's very easy for the shepherd to get angry at the rebel sheep, to judge them, to write them off. But Moshe catches up with the sheep and discovers that it ran away because of an essential thirst for warmth, for love, for God. And like Moshe, so must we. You know how Chabad stops you in the street? "Excuse me, are you Jewish?" How do they know who is and who isn't? Well, let me let you in on a little secret. If somebody stops and they ask you about the black boxes you're holding or the candlesticks you're giving out, you'll know they're probably not Jewish, more likely Mormon. But when you make eye contact with them and they suddenly cross the street, there's the Jew. Kind of reminds me of a rabbi colleague of mine in Manchester who was standing outside his shul one morning in his talis and tefillin, flying away in the wind, trying to find a Jew, a 10th man to make up the minyan. People are walking past, casting him cursory glances, except for one man who stops and says, "What's the matter with you, standing outside like that? Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" And without missing a beat, the rabbi said, "You're just the one I'm looking for. Come inside and be that 10th Jew." You see, they're crossing the street because the sight of those religious artifacts, it touches them, it speaks to them, it suddenly brings back to them the stories. They're running away like the runaway lamb discloses that their Judaism is alive and active inside. Their neshamas, their souls have been triggered, and now it is our task to help them and re-engage them with their traditions to make those long-lost stories come alive once more. There was a Jewish man, an elderly Yid, back in the 70s, who would push his pretzel stand down Wall Street every single day. And a sign hanging on the stand next to the warm, succulent snack read, "Pretzels, 25 cents. Every afternoon at lunchtime, without fail, a smartly dressed businessman would step out of his office, walk past the pretzel stand, hand the vendor a quarter, 25 cents, but never took a pretzel. And that repeated itself day after day, week after week, month after month. And then one day the man walks out of his office, walks past the pretzel stand, hands the vendor a quarter as per usual, starts to walk on. The vendor goes running, excuse me. The businessman turns around, I know. You want to know why it is that I give you 25 cents every day, but I never take a pretzel? To which the vendor replied, no, actually, I just wanted to let you know that the price of pretzels has gone up to 30 cents. That, friends, is what we call Jewish chutzpah. And it is precisely that audacity that has enabled us as Jews throughout the ages to reach outside our comfort zones, to extend clear of our natural limits, to live further than our wildest dreams, and achieve beyond every imaginable goal. It's that same chutzpah that enabled Avraham to challenge God in defense of Saddam, that galvanized Moshe to brazenly threaten God, as it were, on behalf of the Jewish nation, to encourage Esther to risk her life and go before King Ahasuerus. Fast forward several millennia, it's that same Jewish chutzpah that spurred Jewish people to pick themselves up from the ineffable events of the Holocaust and look to build again, to achieve greatness in science, medicine, technology, to transform a desert into a land that blossoms with milk and honey, and so much more besides. And it is that same chutzpah which strengthens our resolve to channel our energies, like the street vendor, to seek out opportunities regardless of what life throws our way, to make this world the better place it was intended to be. Sure, we might think to ourselves, but I'm a mortal being. what kind of impact can I really have on the world? Who am I? What kind of difference can I really make? The answer is found in Jewish law, because Maimonides says categorically every single Jew has an obligation to envisage the world as though it is balanced on a perfectly even scale. And when we stand there in Rosh Hashana, we have to realize that the one good deed, the one act of kindness, the one mitzvah you do can tip the scales of the world to the side of merit and goodness and bring imminent salvation to the entire universe. Jewish chutzpah means that you believe fundamentally that you were created in the image of God. That is the essence of what Rosh Hashanah is all about. You see yourself literally as God-like. You appreciate with every fiber of your being that you can partner God by continuing the creative process. He created the earth, you develop it. He created mankind, you enhance it. He created you, you strive to make heaven a place on earth. So here we are before Rosh Hashanah, and we're thinking to ourselves, I want a sweet new year ahead. What do I need to do? Well, here's a question to think about. If you were to go in search of two words, just two words, that essentially sums up the mission statement of the Jew, what would they be? Have you ever thought about that? Be good, give money, say l'chaim. The two words to my mind are ripple effect. By definition, it's what we otherwise know as the chaos theory. When a butterfly flaps its minuscule wings, creating an ever so tender and faint wind in London, it can gather momentum and build speed to eventually become a strong wind that touches the tides of Mexico. Nowhere and at no time in living memory has that been the case than now. The mere idea of a germ being released somewhere in China, and look where the entire world is now 5 months, 6 months on. That's the awesome power of the ripple effect. But if it can work like that in the negative, then how much more so in the positive as well? The scene is a tiny town in Alaska. The young Chabad rabbi walks into the mayor's office and announces his presence. He says, I'm here to bring the spice and spirit of Yiddishkeit to the Jews of Alaska. The mayor says, that's great, but there are no Jews in this particular town. He says, what, no synagogue, nothing? Nope, nothing. He says, well, I traveled all this distance. Can I at least speak to in one of the local schools? So the arrangements are made, and that same afternoon, the young rabbi is speaking to a group of non-Jewish primary school kids about Yiddishkeit, talking to them about the significance of Noahide laws and so on. And then he said, who amongst you has ever seen a Jew? After a small moment of silence, a little hand is raised. A little girl. She says, I have. My mom. It's kind of like the time I once walked into a Jewish day school in London the day before Rosh Hashana with a shofar behind my back. And I said to the kids, what are we going to see in Shul tomorrow that we don't see all year round? And one little kid raised her hand and said, my mom. But that's another story. Now, what is the rabbi going to relate to this young girl and her mother? What kind of message can he impart to such deeply assimilated souls? Go to Shul, there is none. Join a Jewish social group, they're the only ones in town. Leave, that's not going to go down well. But he left her with a sterling thought that is as penetrating as it is simple. Because, for Jews, there's a very special day each week. It's called Shabbos, he told her. Jewish mothers and daughters throughout the world have a special custom where they light a candle just before the onset of this special Shabbos. They light a candle which symbolizes illumination and warmth and peace. And then he added something which I find incredibly moving, because New Zealand and Alaska are the two furthest stretches of the universe, separated by just under 24 hours. He told this young fair-haired girl, imagine so many thousands of people across the globe lighting that candle each week. It's all a chain reaction which begins at sunset in New Zealand and ends with sunset right here in Alaska. And then he said, be sure to light your candle. You're the last link on the chain. The rest of the world is waiting for you. Could you imagine what the world would be like if we all paused long enough to think ourselves as the last link on the chain? Do you dare consider that the rest of the world is waiting for you? That is the ultimate challenge. To realize that no act is committed in isolation. It could be a trivial deed, something we don't really give much consideration to. A simple, kind word, a small gesture, but it resonates, and it has compelling effects that reverberate well beyond our immediate confines and echoing throughout the course of history. That's the ripple effect. That is the power of your every single act. It's not just in the moment, it has consequences that linger eternal. Never underestimate your power. The ripple effect is the reality of life and is the mission statement of the Jew. It's the message of Rosh Hashanah. We need to reflect on what we've been through, or maybe still going through somewhat, and determine what we can do to turn it all around. We may not be medical doctors or scientists, and frankly, we currently are at their mercy to discover a vaccine, but every single one of us is a spiritual doctor with a spiritual vaccine that can make dramatic impacts on our universe. And I'll share with you this. Hasidism, Jewish mysticism in general, makes the observation that things as they exist in the material are always a manifestation of the spiritual. And I suggest that the fact that we find ourselves having to wear masks hiding our faces maybe suggests that something is going on upstairs as well. It's not an original thought. When is the one time we find ourselves wearing masks? On Purim. Who's the heroine of the Purim story? Esther. The Talmud asks the question, where do we find reference, some sort of hint about Esther in the Torah, and the Talmud answers citing a verse from last week's Torah portion, the Anochi Haster Astir Ponai, I will hide my face as God. So nice play on words, Esther and Astir, which means hidden. That's the reality of the Purim story. There was an ongoing overt threat, and we wear masks or fancy dress to reflect that. Only these days, it's not Purim, is it? In many respects, far from it. And yet we find ourselves hiding our faces or parts thereof, which, as I said, may reflect a certain reality, a certain austere up above as well. But here's the real point, because the verse in Song of Songs says, behold, he is standing behind the walls, looking through the window, peering through the lattice, in reference to God. When someone is looking through the window, you see them just as they see you. When one is peering through the lattice, they still see you, even as you cannot readily see them. In the Purim story, God was austere, maybe wearing a mask, maybe peering through a lattice. Maybe we didn't necessarily see him, but we know he was still seeing us. He was weaving the tapestry of collective coincidences, which were really, in essence, miracles in disguise. And that's why we must take heart. Yes, it's been a terribly difficult time. So much loss, whether it be life, finance, whatever it is. But I have to believe, I have to know, just as we must all come to know that whilst for my thoughts are not your thoughts, and we cannot possibly fathom why this is happening, still, God is peering through the lattice, and out of the darkness will yet come greater light. On Rosh Hahshanah and Yom Kippur, think about the lessons. Lockdown and isolation forced us to reset, to take time out from our rat race, tumultuous lifestyle. Now we can all determine how in the coming year we'll take extra moments of spiritual respite from our workload in life, to think beyond the confines of our own limitations, our material pursuits, our next conquest. Rosh Hahshanah is the day that man was first brought into being, when we have to remember the time-hallowed words of our sages. Man was created alone, singular, because he is obligated to me, to say, for me was this world created. Each of us must have the chutzpah to believe the world was created for me. And if the world was created for me, then the rest of the world is waiting for me to make the differences that will positively affect all mankind. And you know, there's a buzzword which has a very negative connotation: super spreader. Someone who's been around others and infected them as a result. It's terrible, it's tragic, and it's not to be made light of. But at the same time, we have to learn some positives, take lessons. We can each become a super spreader of positivity and goodness in our homes, in our workplace, in our communities. There are countless opportunities that come our way each and every day where we are summoned, whether consciously or otherwise, to create ripple effects. Right now, yes, the trek of life is challenging. For some, presently, the journey may be overwhelming. Sometimes it may be difficult to be a loud and proud Jew. But standing up for yourself, for what you represent, despite whatever the world may throw at you, goes to the very essence of what a Jew is. And then reaching out to another with a message of love, some encouragement, a little bit of Ahavas Yisrael, that is the mission statement of the Jew, the ripple effect. That's how you bring redemption into the life of another, and that's how you bring redemption to the world. And I'll leave you with this final story. There's this young yeshiva boy. He's 23, and he's on the dating scene. He's also a little desperate. You see, the world he comes from, 20 is already more the average. At 23, you're kind of over the hill. Not, I hasten to stress, for lack of prospects. He was a very popular boy in yeshiva, and he'd get plenty of shidduch offers. The problem is, no girl made it past the first date for a purely technical reason. He was a good-looking boy, but he had a deep scar across his left cheek. Now, you see, a shidduch is often, it's blind date. No Facebook, no Twitter, no resume. There's no way to know what the girl or boy would look like until you meet them. And the girls, frankly, didn't like what they saw. So he went to seek spiritual guidance, and he was advised, from now on, just cut to the chase. Before anything else, just tell whichever girl in question how the scar came about. So a couple of months later, another appropriate prospect came up. He agreed to go out with her. They sit down for drinks, and before they even talk about anything, he says, let me tell you how I got the scar. She looks immediately uncomfortable. She assumes that maybe he saw her looking at him in an awkward way. So he reassures her, no, this is the advice that was given. Hear me out. So she agrees, okay. And he says, a few years ago, when I was 17, I was at the Kotel, at the wall in Israel, for Birchat Kohanim, the special priestly blessing to which literally thousands gather on Chol Hamoed Sukkos. I was walking through the Shar Shechem to get a train, a Rakevet Kala in Jerusalem, to get back to my house. And as I was walking through the Shechem gate, I saw an Arab guy coming out of a store and started to chase down a whole group of people, amongst which was a young Jewish girl with a knife in his hand. And I decided to be a have-a-go hero. I went to intervene. I knocked the guy to the ground. The girl made it to safety. And in seconds, the army are on the scene and neutralized the threat. But in those few moments that we were tussling on the ground, he succeeded to slash my face. That's how I got my scar. And as he's telling the story with a fair bit more detail, he sees the girl looking increasingly perplexed. And by the time he's done, she's literally in tears. She looks up to him and she says, Mazel Tov, we're engaged. And he's like, I just about know your name. What do you mean we're engaged? I don't need your pity. And she says, I was that girl. To every other girl in the world, that scar is going to be something really ugly. But to this one girl, it is the most beautiful thing, because one man's scar is another man's beauty spot. We can easily identify scars in people. We can readily judge them, assume them to be ugly. They can't light the fire. They can't pray. They don't know where to go. The challenge for us is to look beyond the skin-deep blemish to the essence within. Don't just look at the lack of fire or the lack of prayer or the lack of direction. Listen to the story, because everybody has a story to tell. Behind those metaphorical scars, there is a story, and when you bring out the story, you see the beauty, and you can ignite that soul once more. So friends, Nietzsche famously said the world is beautiful but has a disease called man. And whilst there may be some men with disease mindsets and ideologies and attitudes to life of their own making, Judaism insists that the precise beauty of the world is made up of those who were made in the image of their creator. The ability to see beauty in the world is the beginning of our moral sensibility and what motivates us to create those necessary ripples without. And when we do, we are assured that we will merit that long sought after redemption that we also desperately yearn for. Let us all strive to make that dream a reality. And each of you should be blessed with a kasiva v'chasima tova and a shana tova masukah to be inscribed for a year and a life and a future filled with an abundance of everything we need and want. Lanu olachol Yisrael. Amen.
Shkoyach. Thank you very much, Rabbi Shochet, for your wonderful and fascinating derasha. We feel now loaded to go to the new year with the insights that you shared with us. Some of the friends have sent me questions through the WhatsApp and the chat on this on the Zoom. You can still send me questions if you have. I have a couple of questions, and I'll go to the first question. It says, repentance, prayer, and charity remove the unfavorable decree. Why those three?
That's a whole lecture in itself. But in a nutshell, there's something unique about these three things in particular. Teshuvah is something that preceded the creation of the world, such that it gives you the very real ability to go back in time, as it were, and erase the past. You know, we talk about forgive and forget. From a basic Torah perspective, all that we can achieve is forgiveness. You bring a sacrifice in temple times or whatever it is. But Teshuvah is a gift that God gave mankind. If there wasn't the gift of Teshuvah, then frankly, all of civilization would have begun and ended with the first man, Adam himself, after he committed that sin. And yet the gift of Teshuvah gives us the very real ability, not just for God to have to forgive us, but because it preceded the world, it transcends time, it gives us the very real ability to go back in time as though the sin never happened. You know, in Vegas, they used to have an expression, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And then years later in modern society, they have a different expression, say, what happened in Vegas never happened. That's the power of Teshuvah. When you say what happened in Vegas stays in Vegas, it means something is there. It's just a skeleton buried in the closet. What happens in Vegas never happened. That's the power of teshuvah. It actually enables you to ensure that the level of forgiveness is such that it never happened. Tefillah is unique, and it's a powerful gift in and of itself. The Talmud relays the story about Chizkiyahu, the king, who was approached by Isaiah the prophet, who was actually a cousin of his, and said to him, he took ill one day, and Isaiah the prophet came to him and said to him, "You're not going to recover, pack your bags, you're going back home to your maker." And he said, "Why? What?" He says, "Because you never fulfilled the mitzvah of even having children. In fact, you never got married." And Ezekiel the king replied and said, "Well, there's a reason for that. It's because I foresaw that if I was to get married and I had a child, he'd grow up to be my successor and he would lead all the Jewish people astray." To which Isaiah then said to him something rather profound. He said, "That may be so, but you have to do what you have to do and let God worry about what he has to do." And Chizkiyahu acknowledged the point and said he was going to go pray. Isaiah said, "Forget it, it's too late." Nevertheless, he turned to the wall, he prayed, he was spared. And yes, he went on, he got married, he had a child, King Menashe, led the people astray, etc. But the Talmud concludes from there that even though it had already been decreed that he wasn't going to survive, he prayed and he was spared, because even if the sword is pressed up against your neck, never give up from divine compassion. That's the power of prayer. And tzedakah, I don't need to tell you, tzedakah is actually written about in every single text, be it from the halachic texts or the Talmudic texts, and certainly all the Hasidic texts, and even the Sifrei Musar, etc. Tzedakah is something that is unique, extraordinary. It is not, as we readily assume it to be, charity. It's actually more justness. You're taking the money that God gave you and are doing with it what God intended for you to do with it. And the fact that you are showing a unique kindness and extending yourself and opening your heart to somebody else is precisely that which in turn will ensure that God will do the same for you. It's only about tzedakah, where we say tzedakah tatzil mamavis. It can actually save from death. That's the power of tzedakah. So of course, there's a plethora of other mitzvahs and et cetera, but these three stand out uniquely in the way they can actually literally, what they do in essence is transform the individual.
Oh, he fell off. He'll be back in a minute.
In the meantime, if you have any other questions, I have at the moment 3 more questions. If you have any other question, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or send me a text to maybe raise your hand. There's an option to raise your hand on the Zoom page next to your name. Or just ask here, leave a question here in the chat window.
Let's see where he is. I'll call him.
He's back.
I am back. I have no idea what happened there. That never happened to me before. My computer just suddenly locked up on me. As I was saying, the point is that these 3 things are actually transforming the individual. By definition, therefore, when I come into shul, even if it's only for a short period of time, and I am now praying, I'm not the same guy as before. When I'm giving tzedakah, I'm not the same guy as before. When I do teshuvah, I'm not the same person as before. So these 3 things in particular are transforming me. And by extension, therefore, as they transform me, they invariably transform my reality as well.
Yeah. Okay, Shkoyach, thank you. Second question. If I've eaten a pomegranate already on Rosh Hahshanah, or before Rosh Hahshanah, on Rosh Hahshanah, can I eat another fruit that I haven't eaten recently for Shehecheyanu?
Well, of course, that goes without saying. There's still a unique significance into eating a pomegranate because it's filled with all the seeds, and we want to reflect on the way that we're filled with so many mitzvot in the way a pomegranate is filled with so many seeds. But insofar as making the special Shehecheyanu prayer is concerned, that therefore requires one to take another fruit that is for the first time that you're eating it this season.
Thank you. How do we understand a good God letting all this happen?
Letting
Corona
happen. Elie Wiesel endured the depths of hell sitting in the pit of Auschwitz. And he summed up as follows: you can either love God or you can really be angry with God, but you can't ignore God. In other words, if you use the concept of human suffering to deny the existence of God, that's a logical absurdity. And in fact, it's extreme arrogance, it's conceitedness. It's like saying, if I can't grasp Einstein's theory of relativity, then it is flawed, it doesn't exist. It doesn't follow logically that my inability to comprehend means it's all wrong. I could be upset, I could be frustrated, but I can't deny the reality. That's an emotional response, not a rational one. So you can love God, you can accept irrespective if you're on that level. You could be angry with God as to why me, why us, and he gets it. But logically, rationally, intellectually, whatever brought you to the acceptance of God's reality in the first instance, or whatever prompted you and motivated you up until this point to embrace his reality, cannot be rejected outright in the face of something like Corona, which we don't understand. Besides, if you deny the reality of God's existence, then there are no questions to begin with. Darwin's theory proves correct. Survival of the fittest. It happened to you. Tough luck. It's only precisely because you believe in God that you can start entertaining the question of why. When Moshe first encountered God at the burning bush, he asked a similar question. He said, "Dear God, what is your name?" And in seeking to identify God, Moshe is looking to understand the intricacies of divine interaction in this universe. Why are the Jewish people suffering in Egypt? Why is there suffering in the world? But God's reply is as enigmatic as it is simple. He said, "I shall be as I shall be." God is telling Moshe that despite your greatness, you remain a finite being, confined to the limitations of time and space, and you can therefore not hope to understand the mechanisms of an infinite being. In other words, in this first ever divine communication to the Jewish nation, God makes it abundantly clear. Tell the Jewish people, I shall be as I shall be. If I am to be a part of your lives, then you know you can't always understand me. And the bottom line is, if you believe in God, then his omnipotence and omnipresence suggests perfection. If God was imperfect, he's limited, he could be terminated, he isn't God. If God is perfect, then he can do no wrong. And though our limited human minds and understanding might well perceive something as wrong or unfair or unjust, ultimately, it's something beyond our own comprehension. In fact, a very worthwhile anecdote to consider in this regard is about the farmer who owned a horse, and one day the horse ran away. And all the townsfolk came and said, "Oh, we're so sorry this happened." And he said, "I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing." Short while later, the horse came back with a bunch of wild horses in tow, and people came to, "Oh, wow, congratulations." He said, "I don't know, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing." One day, his son went riding out on one of the wild horses and fell off and broke his leg. And people said, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, this is terrible." And he said, "I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing." And then the king decided to conscript all the young able-bodied men into the military, only, of course, the farmer's son couldn't go because he had a broken leg. And the farmer said, "Now I know. When my horse ran away, it was a good thing." And the point of the story is obvious. Life is a series of events. And until we reach the end of the series, it's near impossible to know exactly why things are happening. Sometimes you'll see it here. Other times, and let's be honest, most often you won't see it until the hereafter. If in the process you can still love God, hey, all the power to you. Again, if you get angry with God, he understands, but you can't ignore God. As in the words of the great Kosker Rebbe, a God I can understand is not a God worth believing in. For the record, it doesn't mean that I can't challenge God. The sixth Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson, once said, we don't have to look to justify God's actions. And the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, pastor, was heard on more than one occasion challenging God openly for allowing the terrible misfortune to befall his chosen people. Abraham didn't sit idly by when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Moshe cries out to God and says, "Why do you allow evil to befall these people?" It's not about questioning God. It's about challenging God, which actually stems from the deepest reservoirs of human faith. So the bottom line is, we don't know enough to comprehend the answer, but we should always believe and care enough to persistently ask the question.
Thank you. And last question at the moment. Can I do annulment of vows on Zoom if I can't go to shul?
ask your local rabbi. The problem with that, annulment of vows per se, in theory, could work for the individual who's doing it over Zoom, but at least the three dayanim, the judges, the three people who will be annulling the vows, have to certainly be sitting together. So if there are three rabbis or three others that are going to be getting together and sitting together and happy to take continuous chain of Zoom calls, right?
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the participants? Okay. Thank you very much, Rabbi Shochet, for your time. We are grateful for your brilliant drasha and the answers. Absolutely fascinating. And in behalf of the Jewish community in Liverpool, may Hashem will send you and your family and your community Kesiva v'chasim toiva, Shana toiva, and may you and your family and your community will be inscribed in the book of life, together with all the Jewish people around the world.
Thank you, and I will only add, as the Lubavitch Rebbe used to emphasize, why he always has to add in, when we wish people a Shana Tova, the Mesukah, to remind people it's not enough to have a good year. It has to be a sweet year. We all need the sweetness in every real sense. So I wish you all a good and sweet year, a Shana Tova U'Mesukah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We remind everyone that tomorrow night we have a visitor from Istanbul, Turkey, Rabbi Mendy Chitrik, who is the Lubavitch emissary to Turkey and the rabbi of the ancient Ashkenazi Jewish community, as well as the president of the Alliance of Rabbis of Islamic States. I bet you never knew that there was such a rabbinic organization. How many rabbis are there in Islamic States? That's your question for tomorrow night. Whoever gets the correct answer wins the prize. Wish you all have a good night, and tell your friends. We'll see you all tomorrow night again. Laila Tov.
Good night.